Ghosts at the Old Library presents Pipistrello, a ghost story for Halloween by Ella Sprakarn.
Bat! The student yelled, interrupting Matt again. Matt didn't bother to look up. He knew there was no bat. There should be bats here on the Fallowfield Loop, at this time of night with these weather conditions. Dry, not too windy, only slightly overcast. But this evening there was not a single bat to be found. The first time the boys shouted, "Bat!" the group of students had staggered about with mirth. The next half a dozen times they chuckled politely. Now no one even smiled. "It's from a TV show. You know, the one about vampires," said the student closest to Matt, apologetically. This was the awful icing on the awful cake of his week. It started with Pipistrello. Things had seemed a little brighter midweek when an email from Christina, Professor of Ethology, darling of Women's Hour, and his ex with a capital E, had pinged into his inbox. "Matt," the email read, "I need you." Even all these years later, his heart fluttered. "I've got bloody COVID and I'm supposed to take my conservation first years out to look for them bats. It's all organised. I just need a grown-up to trot them along the Fallowfield Loop. I thought of you. It's just round the corner from you and Jane, right?" Matt's wife was called Joan. "Say you'll do it. Ta so much." The speed he had replied in the affirmative had been a little undignified. He felt guilty, too, at how little it took to distract him from his terrible grief about Pipistrello. When he met the group at the quadrant, the setting sun streaked the low grey clouds with red and orange. Here, just a stone's throw from the bright lights and diesel fumes of the A6, the loop rose to meet the residential streets of Levenshulme. Out of the dozen students, only a few names or faces stuck. Georgia, a postgrad who looked like Grace Jones in a Paramo smock. Angela, a first year with short blonde hair and perfect eye makeup, whose wheelchair had an intricate pattern of leaves and field mice painted on the wheel covers. Tim, a gormless farmer type who Matt quickly came to think of as the Bat Shouter. The rest were a blur of soft-shell jackets, nascent beards, wire-rimmed spectacles and unmitigated hope. Despite his mood and an early setback, his bat detector was out of batteries. He had tried his best. As he marched the students along the loop, he told them about its history. A disused railway line brought into use as a walking and cycling route in the early noughties. And he realised these kids were not even born when this section was opened. Interrupted by as many shrieks of "Bat!" as polite questions, he told them about the strange relationship between non-human animals and the man-made environment. He answered their questions about ancient woodland and modern industry, about maternity roosts, about bat reproduction, navigation and diet. Georgia asked clever, but ever so slightly interdisciplinary questions. Conversation was straying into echolocation and the phenomenology of consciousness when the Bat Shouter interrupted. "Have you ever seen a ghost down here?" said Tim, peering into the trees that loomed over the path. "Huh? Like, I don't know, any kind of ghost?" "Well, there's a pet graveyard a little further down here in Highfield Park," Matt offered. The only question Matt could not answer was, where are the bats? It was mating season, and the time of year when bats begin to build up their fat reserves for winter hibernation. There should be bats overhead, fluttering along the trees and hedges that line the tar-macadammed path, looking for love and midges. Matt's hangover didn't help. It had only grown in grim intensity as the day progressed. Now, in its final act, it buzzed malevolently in his teeth. The night before, he had fallen asleep on the sofa, drunk on red wine and grief. That morning, in the kitchen making coffee, his wife had looked at his bloodshot eyes and sighed. "I'm worried about Pip too," she had said, "but this," she gestured to the empty bottles by the kitchen bin, "is getting ridiculous. He's just a cat." Matt hadn't said anything. Avoiding her gaze, he had looked out into their little yard and contemplated the sickly morning. "He's gone off for a day or two before. I'll message your street WhatsApp group again and ask them to check their sheds." Matt knew that Pipistrello was not coming back. Pipistrello was not in a neighbour's shed. In his coat pocket was a card receipt for £25. the cost of a communal cremation for a small black cat. He had barely held it together at work. That dreadful day on a site visit, while crawling into a thicket seeking evidence of badgers, Matt had been haunted by thoughts of familiar bright eyes looking back at him. Now, as night sank down, it started to rain, and their chances of seeing bats faded with the light. Following the route once taken by chugging steam engines, Matt led the group through dank tunnels and under graffitoed bridges. Between a green metal footbridge and an entrance to Highfield Country Park, Matt brought the group to a halt. An expanse of open parkland, lit by the security lights of a primary school, stretched towards the wood. It was that awkward time of year when summer toppled into autumn. Despite Matt's expensive raincoat, a river of cold rain and warm sweat ran down his spine. As he prepared to give his closing statement, he put his hand into his pocket and found a pellet of something damp and pulpy. It was a long moment, turning the thing over with his fingertips, before he remembered what it was. The receipt. He looked at the students' faces and saw that he had infected them with his gloom. Faces shadowy under raincoat hoods, the distant lights of the school illuminated noses, cheeks and spectacle lenses. But there, lantern-jawed and gimlet-eyed, framed by the sopping fronds of a fur-lined parka, one face stood out. A hard, expectant stare. At the figure's feet, a low, dark hound panted and steamed menacingly. An interloper, a member of the public, the horror. Tonight, Matt said, scrambling for words, was all about the bats. With a rattling chuckle, the man interrupted. That's not entirely true, is it? Not just bats, not tonight. Matt gaped at him. Then, wheezing in unison, man and dog greasily slid off down the loop in the direction of Gorton. Someone giggled, a sound that was all unsettled edges. The bat shouter did not shout, "Bat!" And not very far away, between the dark trees of the park, something mewed. Turning towards the half-heard sound, Matt's attention was caught and held by shapes fluttering above the tree line. Black flecks tumbled upwards in defiance of rain and gravity, silhouetted against the sulphur-streaked horizon for one moment before being lost to sight. "Bat!" Matt shouted, in accidental mimicry, pointing towards the park. "Look, there are bats over there!" Matt's plan to heroically lead the students batward had one barrier, an A-frame barrier. The gap in the fence to the park was framed by two angled pieces of steel, too narrow and too awkward for a motorcycle, or indeed a wheelchair, to pass through. "The email said this would be accessible," said Angela, bristling. Georgia, the postgrad, stood at her side, looking serious. Matt regarded the barrier. "Could we, maybe..." He awkwardly mimed helping her from her chair, knowing as he did it that it was absolutely the wrong thing to suggest. Short, harsh words were directed at Matt. The spectre of his ex, the professor, was invoked. All he could say, before the two women turned down the loop, was, But there are bats!" Angela and Georgia were not the only deserters. Next, a pair of international students exchanged glances, found wordless understanding, and headed for the cosy cafe they'd spotted on the bus ride in. Then, just within the park's boundaries, 3 of the students paused and regarded the looming tree line and the strengthening rain. Calling to their friends further ahead, they recruited 2 more and made their collective escape pub-bound. Still, 3 students, 3 boys of course, remained at Matt's heel. The brave, the curious, and the studious. It made sense that the bats would find shelter among the trees of the park, Matt thought as he strode along the bosky path. There may even be long-eared or Dorberton's bats, though it would be impossible to tell without his bat detector. But if he could only find the bats, tonight will not be a complete failure. When the debacle of the evening got back to Christina, at least he could say he showed them goddamn bats. Sound moved strangely in the wood. Below the pitter-patter of rain falling through branches, below the squelch of shoes in mud, below the exclamations of the boys, there was another soft and attenuated mew. The remaining students did not appear to hear it. Stood on the path by a clearing, the surrounding trees provided the perfect edge for bats to fly along. Against the soft glow of the setting sun in the northeast, they watched unknown creatures flutter. "Look! I saw one! Me too!" A feathered flash overhead and flying straight across the open sky. A parakeet, perhaps. Acidic green wings faded to a dull grey. Further along the path, between the grey sentinels of the trees, night was pooling. From this darker darkness, a sound emerged. The sound. The terrible clarion call of Monday morning. The sound that had caused Matt to slam on the brakes and leap from his car. It was not very loud, for Pipistrello was not a very big cat. But even if it was loud, only Matt would have heard it. It was the inhuman sound of a little black cat crushed under a car wheel. The students heard Matt cry, "Oh, Pipistrello!" and then watched as he staggered down the path, stumbling around fallen tree branches till he turned the corner and was lost to sight. It was Tim who found Matt. He'd seen some things on the family farm, and a bit of urban woodland held little terror for him. By the reedy light of his phone, he located one grave. Jimmy, farm dog, born April 4, 42. Then another. Jimmy, 1925 to 1936. And then finally, Matt. Matt wept with happiness. Raindrops raced tears down his face. Beneath his hands, the shade of Pipistrello pushed his unbroken spine against his oldest friend and purred a silent purr. Back down the path, in the clearing near the loop, the hatchet-faced man watched his dog leap and tumble through the wet grass. He pushed his parka hood back, lit a rollie and smiled. This was his favourite night of the year. Good weather for it too. Reunited with his littermates, the old hound yipped like he was a puppy again, his tail whisking back and forth like a furry metronome. And up above it all, the bats had finally come out to feed on midges, to play and make love. Across the Levenshulme night, uncommon pipistrelle zipped and tumbled with the swooping wraiths of budgies, canaries and African grey parrots.
You've just been listening to Pipistrello, a ghost story for Halloween, written and read by Ella Sprakarn with music by Oscilloscope. This tale is part of Ghosts at the Old Library, made possible by funding from the Arts Council England and creative director Richard V. Hurst. Stay tuned for Ghosts at the Old Library Part 3, coming December 2024. See levenshulmeoldlibrary.org.uk or our social media for more details.